My name is Amelie. I am 34, and on this quiet evening, I am sitting in my bright apartment, the same one that I took out a mortgage on 3 years ago after a dozen nervous visits to a realtor and a credit manager, holding a plastic folder with income statements and stamps in my hands, and reading an email from the HR department of my company where they inform me in neat business-like phrases that they need a person for a long-term assignment to our European branch. And for some reason, this person, as they kindly hint, seems to be me. They want to send me for 2 years. Imagine, for 2 whole calendar circles. And although formally this sounds like a brilliant opportunity, a wave of doubt immediately arose inside me. Because 2 years is not a vacation or an internship. It is too long a pause in my usual life. Too long a separation from home and from what I have so painstakingly collected here, piece by piece. I work for a big tech company where the glass boardrooms reflect our ambitions. And to be honest, I have a pretty decent position there. I've worked my way up to the level where I'm invited to important tables, and my arguments are listened to, and the salary there is such that it was thanks to it that I was able to get into this small, but, as I like to say, my own world on the 48th floor, overlooking the river and the railway bridges. Nothing luxurious, no marble fireplaces or wine rooms, but it is mine, you see, my nest, my order in the kitchen, my books, my carefully chosen lamps, and if I'm being completely honest, it is mine too, because the mortgage payments are still at least a decade away, and every month I carefully cross out another line, breathe more evenly, and promise myself that I will not break down. Here's the rub. I can't leave the apartment empty for 2 years. It would be both worrisome and downright stupid, because no one is going to waive the monthly payments, and paying them for nothing while I'm on another continent and not using the kitchen or the bathroom is like throwing money out the window. And at some point, over a sip of cold coffee, I caught myself thinking that the smartest thing to do would be to rent out the place and use the rent payments directly to cover the mortgage. I dialed the number of a lawyer I knew, Mike, who helped me when I bought this place, and when he said a cheerful, "Hey, Amelie," I said, trying to sound confident, "Mike, I need to ask you something, and when you pick up the phone, you'll weigh every word carefully, because this is not an easy story." To which he chuckled, pushing away what sounded like a coffee cup, and replied, "Go ahead, I'm all ears." "They're sending me abroad to work for 2 years," I exhaled. "I want to rent out my apartment so I don't drown in payments. Tell me how to do it right and not get into trouble with the tax authorities." And Mike quietly laughed his lawyer's laugh, in which you can always hear a blade of common sense, and said, "You'll need a competent lease agreement. I'll prepare a template, we'll write down the deposit, terms, responsibility, and then you can just include the income in your tax return. It's not painful, especially if you keep track of your expenses and save everything. I emphasize, all the receipts, from masking tape to the plumber's receipt." His words unexpectedly highlighted what I had been trying hard not to notice. I needed to take a critical look at the condition of the apartment, and although it was not bad, there was something to fix, to tidy up before the new people arrived, so that it would be clean and pleasant for them, and for me to be at peace. And since I was going away for a long time anyway, it was better to do it now. So I decided to call in contractors and give the walls a shine that would make them seem to straighten their shoulders. I found the team on the recommendation of a friend, a tried and tested Seraphan where everyone is ready to vouch for their head. And the very next Monday, 3 guys in work boots and equally tired baseball caps showed up to me. And the main one, introducing himself as Tony, looked around the rooms and asked in a businesslike manner, "Well, where do we start, and what is the weakest point here?" And I took him to the kitchen, where the paint had faded in some places, showed him the bathroom, where the seams on the old tiles were asking for a new life, and in the living room I ran my finger along the wall, where scuffs were visible under the lamp. "It's not a cosmic job," Tony summed up. "Repaint the kitchen, retile the bathroom, freshen up the walls in the living room, do it neatly and evenly." And seeing how I was mentally counting the weeks until leaving, he added, 2 weeks maximum, we'll manage. But you won't be able to stay here while we work. There will be dust, noise, sanding, smells. You don't need that." And I nodded, because I had long been afraid of this very conversation. I called Sarah, an old friend of mine from across town, who has a big house with old elm trees on the porch and a guest room that's always available, and said, smiling into the phone as if she could see my guilty look, "Sarah, can I stay the night at your place? Well, not just one night, but a couple of weeks while I finish renovating before my business trip." And she didn't even let me finish. "Of course, dear. My bed is already made. You know you're always welcome. Come today." I quickly packed my things, a few clothes, a laptop, a folder with documents, 2 favorite glasses, without which tea seems strange, moved into her guest room, which smelled of lavender and freshly washed towels. And the next day the contractors began work, and how grateful I was to fate that I did not stay in the apartment, because the roar of a drill and the screech of a grinder reached me even when I drove past the house on the way to Sarah's and stopped for a minute to look in, check on how things were going, and leave the workers a bag of coffee and donuts. But there was one but that was tugging at my sleeve like a restless child. I still hadn't told my parents about it, and it was a burden, because we have a good relationship. They're just very involved in my life. They like to take part in literally everything I do, give advice that I don't ask for, and make suggestions that are more like orders, if you know what I mean, and I can hear their voices perfectly well even before I dial the number. My younger sister Lisa is 8 years younger than me. She's 26, she still lives with her parents, and this doesn't surprise me at all because they love to take care of her, rolling out a mat of care and hints for her, and as far as I can remember, they've always coddled her. Lisa had been dating a guy named Jake for about 6 months now, and while I had to admit that he was handsome enough on the outside, trim, with the right smile that seemed to have been rehearsed in front of a mirror, he didn't really do anything special, worked little and without much enthusiasm, and at times it seemed like his life revolved around my parents' dinners and evenings in Lisa's company. But to be honest, Lisa herself wasn't much different. Despite being 26, she still had neither a clear plan nor a stable job, and all of her academic achievements in college were largely paid for by me, because my parents then threw up their hands and said that they simply could not afford such expenses. And I, of course, could not leave my sister without help and took on the bulk of the costs. However, I knew that no matter how long I put it off, sooner or later I would have to tell them about the offer from Europe. And this knowledge hung over me like a heavy cloud, because I could imagine that they would have their own opinion, expressed loudly and in detail, as they love to do, because they always do this, even if I don't ask for it directly. And so, 2 weeks before leaving, I finally gathered up the last of my courage, dialed my mother's number, and hearing her familiar, warm, "Hello, Amelie," said, "Hi, Mom. Can I come to dinner with you tonight?" "I want to share some news." Mom perked up and immediately replied, "Of course, dear. I'll cook your favorite dish," and added casually, "By the way, Lisa and Jake will be coming too." At 6 in the evening, I showed up on the doorstep of their house with a bottle of wine in my hands, because that's how it is with us. When you come to a family dinner, you bring something for the table. Their house was spacious and cozy. They had bought it when I was in high school, and it had remained just as well kept, with neatly trimmed bushes by the porch and a big fireplace in the living room. And sure, it was bigger and more spacious than my apartment, but it had always had their signature. We sat around the table and my mother served the stew, rich and thick, just like the kind she made on special days, and as soon as I took my first spoonful, I felt that same taste of childhood again, where every Sunday smelled like the same thing. Lisa sat next to Jake, and as she often did, she spent most of her time staring at her phone, scrolling through her feed and barely looking up, which was typical of her. Mom, adjusting her napkin in her lap, finally asked, "So, Amelie, what news did you want to share with us?" I took a deep breath, as if about to jump into cold water, and said, "The company has offered me a position in our branch in Europe. I'll be gone for 2 years, and I'll be working there." My parents looked at each other, their usual family look that spoke louder than words, and then looked back at me. "Tell us more," Mom said. leaning forward, and I patiently laid out the gist of the offer: the duties, the timing, the prospects. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lisa roll her eyes, the same gesture she always made when talking about my job, as if my career was something boring and unnecessary to her. But Dad smiled and said, "That sounds wonderful, dear. We're proud of you." "Thank you," I replied. "But there's one more thing. I'm planning on renting out my apartment while I'm gone because I can't leave it empty for 2 years, and I still have to pay the mortgage." At that moment, the atmosphere in the room changed noticeably. Mom and Dad exchanged that look again, and I immediately knew that this was about to begin their silent conversation, which lasts for a second and then turns into a joint decision. "And indeed," Mom said slowly, as if weighing each word, "you don't need to rent out the apartment to strangers. Lisa and Jake could live there. Then you'll know that the property is in good hands, and you won't have to worry about tenants ruining your home." I blinked, trying to process what she said. "Excuse me?" Mom immediately continued, looking at me almost pleadingly. "Your sister needs her personal space, and Jake could use it too. Besides, they're planning on getting married soon, which would be a good start." I glanced at Lisa, who had just been listlessly scrolling through her phone, but was now sitting up straight as if she really cared about the topic. And Jake, who was sitting next to me, was smiling as widely and smugly as if someone had just announced that he'd won the lottery. "Okay," I said carefully, trying to sound calm. "If they really want to rent the apartment from me, I'm fine with that. In fact, I'm even willing to give you 20% off the price I was originally going to ask." There was a deathly silence. Mom's face went pale, and she finally spoke in a different, firm voice. "Are you serious? Do you really want to charge your sister rent?" I looked at her, feeling my temper boiling, and said, "Mom, I have a mortgage to pay. The whole point of renting out the apartment is to cover those bills while I'm gone." "But she's family," Mom said, getting louder, as if the volume could change the meaning of the words. And then Lisa finally looked up from her phone and said, "Oh my God, Emily, you're so greedy. I can't believe you won't let me just live there. I'm helping the family. Who paid for Lisa's college education when you said you couldn't afford it? Who lent you money every time you asked?" The words were out of my mouth before I could think about them, and the room fell tensely silent, broken only by Dad clearing his throat as if he was buying himself a second to think of a good retort. "It's different, honey," he finally said, but I raised my eyebrows and asked, "How is it different exactly?" Lisa leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with challenge, and almost without thinking, she blurted out, "Because you make so much more than we do. You can afford for me to live there rent-free." I felt the blood rush to my face, my heart pounding, my blood pressure soaring. "Lisa, I make more money because I work so hard, because I stay late at the office, because I've been building my career step by step," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "and I have bills to pay too." "I need that income," Dad cleared his throat and, as if defending himself, said, "We're saving for Lisa's wedding." I stared at him, feeling my insides twist. "And I'm saving to pay my mortgage," I said quietly but clearly. "How is my situation different from yours?" Lisa slammed her hand down on the table, shaking the glasses, and blurted out, "Because we're your family. And besides, I don't want to live in that rented apartment Jake and I share. It's in a terrible neighborhood. Yours is downtown, close to everything." I looked at her and said slowly, "So you want to live in a nicer apartment, but you don't want to pay for it?" "Oh God, you're such a jerk," Lisa said, and the word was so venomous that it made my insides go cold. And then Jake, who had been sitting silently next to me, finally spoke up. "Look, Emily, we wouldn't trash it or anything. We'd take good care of it." I nodded, meeting his gaze, and said, "I'm sure we would, but I'm not a charity case." The silence in the room after these words was so loud you could hear a pin drop. My mother's voice was icy when she said, "I think you should go." "That's fine with me," I said, grabbing my purse from the chair and heading for the door. No one stood up to see me off, no one said a goodbye, and I just walked out. The drive back to Sarah's house was a blur, my hands shaking as I held the steering wheel, and I barely knew how I was getting there. I was shaking with anger, my heart breaking with hurt. How dare they act like I owed them something? Like I was doing something wrong just because I wanted to collect rent for the apartment I was paying for every month. When I walked into Sarah's house, she was standing in the kitchen chopping vegetables. "Hey, how was dinner?" she asked, looking up and immediately noticing my face. "Oh, what the hell happened?" I sat down on a chair and told her everything, word for word, while the kettle was boiling, not missing a single line, not missing a single look because it was all too hard to keep inside. Sarah shook her head, and her eyes reflected not surprise, but rather sad understanding. "Amelie, darling, I hate to say this, but they always preferred Lisa. Even when we were teenagers, it was obvious. She got away with a lot, and you were expected to be responsible, to help, to be mature. You were always the one they could rely on." I covered my face with my hands and whispered, "You're right. I know you're right, but it still hurts." Sarah made tea, put a mug in front of me, and we sat at the kitchen table until almost midnight, reminiscing about all the times my parents had asked me for money or expected me to help Lisa pay for her school fees, her car, her small debts, or simply looked at me like the family ATM. "You're doing the right thing," she finally said. "Don't let them pressure you into changing your mind." I nodded, clutching the mug in my hands, and said, "I won't let them, but God, this is so awful." The next 3 days were unexpectedly quiet. No calls from my parents, no messages from Lisa, no hint of a conversation. On the one hand, I felt relieved because the silence finally allowed me to breathe more freely. But on the other, it hurt because they hadn't even tried to understand my situation. On the 4th day, I decided to go to my apartment to check on the progress of the renovation. When I walked in, my heart leapt with joy. The builders were finished, and the apartment looked absolutely stunning. Fresh paint lay perfectly flat, new plumbing sparkled in the bathroom, and newly installed hardware shone in the kitchen. Tony and his crew did a great job, turning my place into a truly cozy place, ready to welcome new tenants. After the builders left and the apartment was filled with silence, I sat on the living room floor for a long time, leaning against the freshly painted wall and scrolling through the online rental applications that had come in over the past few days on my laptop. There were quite a few of them, from different people: students, young families, some wanting to stay temporarily, some for the long term, but one profile immediately stood out from the crowd. Mark and Jennifer Chin are neat, thorough. Both have stable jobs in reputable companies, excellent credit history, and references that sounded so convincing that I couldn't help but smile. They seemed like ideal candidates, the kind of tenants that wouldn't leave you scratching your head or worrying at night. Without further ado, I called the number listed, and after a couple of rings, a female voice answered, "Hello, this is Jennifer." "Good afternoon, this is Amelie. I'm calling about renting an apartment." I introduced myself, and felt a slight excitement creep into my voice. "Would you like to see the apartment? I could meet you during the day, say the day after tomorrow around 2 o'clock. "That would be ideal," she answered immediately. "We are very interested." "Great, I'll send you the address," I said, and we said goodbye, both clearly satisfied with the conversation. 2 days later, I arrived at the house a little earlier than the appointed time and waited in the car with a cup of coffee, watching the passers-by hurrying about their business. Exactly at 2 o'clock, as scheduled, a couple approached the entrance, both smart in their early 30s, dressed in a business style that immediately inspired confidence. We said hello, and as we walked to the elevator, I told them about the neighborhood, about how there was a convenient grocery store around the corner and a cozy restaurant with great Italian food 2 blocks away. "That sounds like a great place," Mark said, and I smiled. "Yeah, I really liked living here." We went up to the 3rd floor, and I got out my key to open the door. "Here we are," I said, turning the lock and pushing the door open. But as soon as we stepped inside, my breath caught in my throat. Lisa was sprawled out on the couch in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, and in the kitchen, at the counter, Jake was making himself a sandwich, looking casual as if he was at home. I saw suitcases in the corner by the window, and my sister's clothes were strewn across the chair next to her. My chest tightened, as if someone had punched me in the gut. "What the hell?" I blurted out, and I felt Mark and Jennifer freeze behind me, clearly confused by what was happening. Lisa looked up from her phone and said, as calmly as if we had just met in a cafe, "Oh, hi, Amelie." "You should have knocked." I snapped back. "Knock? This is my apartment." Jake turned from the counter, still holding his sandwich, and nodded at Mark and Jennifer, completely brazenly. "Hey," he said, as if meeting was the most natural thing in the world. Mark and Jennifer exchanged glances, and there was confusion in their eyes, as if they had gotten into someone else's family drama that they had no intention of getting involved in. Maybe this is not the right time?" Jennifer said hesitantly. "No, it's not the right time." My voice became sharp and loud. "These people shouldn't be here at all." Lisa rose from the couch and, placing her hands on her hips, said, "Actually, we should. Mom gave us the key yesterday. We're staying here while you're gone." I couldn't believe my ears. "What did you say?" "The spare key I gave Mom when I bought this place?" Lisa nodded calmly. "Yes, she gave it to us yesterday and we moved in last night." My hands shook with anger, my breathing became heavy, and I could feel my pulse pounding somewhere in my temples. Jennifer touched my arm gently. "Maybe we should come back another time," she said quietly, but I immediately objected. "No, wait." But I could already see from their faces that they had made up their minds. It was too weird, too awkward. "We'll call you," Mark said, and with a polite nod they left, their footsteps gradually fading down the hallway, leaving behind them the heavy echo of a broken deal. I turned to Lisa and Jake, who were looking at me as if I didn't belong there. "Get out," I said through clenched teeth. "We're not going anywhere," Lisa replied, as calmly as if it were a given. "Mom said we could stay." Jake nodded and added with a smug grin, "Yeah, and don't worry about the rent or anything. We figured you could keep paying for it yourself." I pulled out my phone and, almost without realizing it, dialed my mother's number. My hands were still shaking with rage, my heart was beating like it wanted to burst out, and my gaze was fixed on Lisa and Jake, who were lounging in my living room like they owned the place, watching my every move with lazy curiosity, as if I was the one invading their space, not they mine. Mom answered only on the third ring, and I, not even trying to hide my anger or pain, immediately asked, "Did you really give Lisa the key to my apartment?" Her voice immediately took on that defensive tone I'd known since childhood, the one that meant only one thing. She knew what she'd done was wrong, but she'd never admit it. "Lisa needs a place to live," she said coldly, "and you're being selfish. I thought if they just moved, you'd finally realize how stupid you were being." I couldn't believe my ears, couldn't believe that my own mother was so easily overstepping my boundaries, as if they didn't exist. "Mom, this is breaking and entering," I said slowly and clearly, trying to keep my voice under control. "They don't have permission to be here." "Don't be dramatic," she interrupted. "They're your family." "I wouldn't care," I said, barely keeping my voice from shaking, even if it was the Pope himself. "This is my apartment, and I haven't given permission to anyone but myself." I told her about Mark and Jennifer, how the perfect potential tenants had walked out the moment they walked in because they had witnessed this absurdity, how awkward they were, how their eyes were frozen in bewilderment. But my mother, as if she hadn't heard, stubbornly insisted that I was overreacting, that I was being greedy and selfish. I hung up without even listening, feeling my insides seething. Behind me, Lisa's loud laughter rang out. "You should have seen your face when you walked in here," she said to Jake, and they both started laughing, as if the whole thing was some kind of joke. "It was priceless," she added, and her words hit me harder than any insult. I couldn't stand being there another minute. I turned and walked out of the apartment without saying a word. The air in the entryway felt heavy, stuffy, but still lighter than the poison that filled my own living room. I walked quickly to the parking lot, got into my car, closed the door, and dialed 911. "I need to report a break-in," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "There are people in my apartment who don't have permission to be there." The dispatcher gave me the address and assured me he'd send a squad. "I'll meet them in the lobby," I added, feeling relief and a new wave of anxiety wash over me with each word. About 20 minutes later, a police car pulled up to the entrance, and two officers, Martinez and Kim, walked into the lobby. We said hello, and as we rode up the elevator, I explained the situation in detail, that I was planning to move to Europe, that my family was demanding that I let Lisa live in my apartment for free, that my mother had given them a spare key without my knowledge, breaking all possible boundaries. We walked up to my door, and I opened it with my key. Lisa and Jake were still inside, but when they saw the police, their complacency evaporated, and for the first time, nervousness flickered in their eyes. "What's going on?" Lisa asked, but her voice was no longer as confident as it had been before. Officer Martinez stepped forward and said calmly but firmly, "We need your identification." They reluctantly pulled out their driver's licenses and handed them to him. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez turned to me, "can you confirm that you did not give these individuals permission to be in your apartment?" "Yes, that's right. I did not give them any permission," I replied, looking straight at him. Officer Kim turned to Lisa and Jake and asked, "Do you have any documentation to prove your right to be here? A lease? Any paperwork?" Lisa shifted from foot to foot, her confidence fading with each passing second. "Our mother gave us a key," she finally managed to say, "and she has a spare. The landlady is standing right here," Officer Martinez said in a calm but firm voice, "and she confirms that she did not give you permission. You need to gather your things and leave the premises within the hour." And that's when Lisa completely lost it. Her face twisted, her eyes filled with tears and anger at the same time, and she screamed that I was ruining her life, that I was a terrible sister, that I had always envied her and was just waiting for a chance to hurt her. Her words were so venomous that I felt my insides tighten, but at the same time, I felt a strange sense of relief that the truth was finally on my side. Then she tried to lunge at me, and in that moment it seemed as if time slowed down. Her eyes were burning with rage, her hair was flying over her shoulders, and her lips were twisted in a grimace of hatred, as if I were her main enemy, guilty of all the troubles in her life. But Officer Kim, acting quickly and decisively, intercepted her arm before she could get close to me, and this movement sounded to me like a sigh of relief, although I knew that everything was just beginning. Jake, instead of calming down and trying to at least outwardly keep his face, only made the situation worse. When he saw the policeman holding Lisa, he lunged forward and, pushing Officer Kim away, shouted with fury, "Get your hands off her!" It was his fatal mistake, because the next second the two officers were acting as one, and before Jake could even process it, he was pinned to the floor, his arms were twisted behind his back, and the cold steel cuffs were clicking into place. Lisa screamed even louder, her voice a shrill shriek that made my temples tremble, and when she tried to kick Officer Martinez in her deranged state, she found herself in cuffs herself. "You're both under arrest," he said firmly and calmly. "Unauthorized entry and assault on a police officer." I stood there and watched, unable to believe that this was really happening. My sister and her boyfriend, handcuffed, standing in my apartment being led out by the arms as if they were criminals. The police led them into the hallway and Lisa continued to scream, throwing words at me that mixed accusations, curses, and impotent threats. But now her screams were mingled with tears, either from fear or from the realization that she had gone too far and had no way out. The door slammed behind them, and there was silence, so unusual after all this storm that I sat down on the couch and just sat there, breathing deeply, trying to come to my senses. But the silence was deceptive. In every corner of the apartment, there were traces of their short stay, like phantoms, reminders of how easily my home could turn into a battlefield. Lisa's sweater hung on the chair, Jake's socks were strewn on the floor, the suitcases stood by the window, pieces of bread and a half-eaten apple lay forlornly on the kitchen counter. I spent the next 2 hours packing their things back into their suitcases, not bothering to be careful. I simply stuffed clothes, shoes, makeup, and random odds and ends into bags, zipping them up as if I were closing the hole their intrusion had left in my life along with them. Then I called a courier service and asked that the suitcases be delivered directly to my parents' house. I didn't want to have to deal with them again, didn't want to personally participate in this humiliating process. While I waited for the courier, I dialed the number of the locksmith the building manager had once recommended to me. "Hi, this is Amelie from apartment 3B, I said. "I need the locks changed today, right now, if possible." He promised to be there in an hour, and true to his word, he arrived with a bag of tools, and within 30 minutes, I had new, shiny locks at my door. Their cold metal giving me a sense of security I had been deprived of for so long. Now I had new keys, and the spare one my parents had left behind was a useless piece of iron. The entire time the locksmith was working, my phone kept ringing. Mom flashed on the screen over and over again, the calls followed by messages, and I watched the accusations come in one after another. She wrote that I was a terrible daughter, that I was selfish, that I had destroyed the family, that I was a monster for letting my sister end up in handcuffs. But I didn't answer a single call, didn't read a single message to the end. I had no strength or desire to justify myself to those who didn't want to see reality. The next morning, the phone rang, and this time the name of Officer Martinez appeared on the screen. His voice was businesslike but polite. "I wanted to let you know that your sister and her boyfriend spent the night in jail. We need to clarify. Do you want to file formal charges?" I thought for a minute. Part of me wanted this, to let them learn the value of their actions, to understand that adult decisions have adult consequences. But another part of me, the part that still remembered that Lisa was still my sister, no matter how awful she was, stopped me. "No," I said after a moment. "I don't want to press charges for trespassing. But the fact that Jake raised his hand against your officer is not my decision." Let the law handle that. Martinez nodded, and I heard a hint of relief in his voice. "I understand. He'll probably get a fine community service, maybe anger management classes. It's not my problem," I said firmly, "and I mean it." I hung up, feeling lighter for the first time in a long time. I had a week ahead of me, just 7 days to find tenants and get ready for my trip to Europe. Mark and Jennifer had already swum out of my arms, scared by the chaos they had witnessed, and now I had to act fast. I dialed my old friend Danny, the real estate agent. "Danny, I need your help," I said. "I'm leaving in a week and I need to rent this place out fast. I can't do it myself." His voice was cheerful and confident. "Sure, send me the photos, I'll list it right away. I'll organize the showings and everything, and you focus on getting ready for the trip." It was exactly what I needed to hear, like a steady hand extended in my darkest hour, and I suddenly felt like, despite everything, I had a chance to take back control of my life. I spent the rest of the day taking careful photographs of the apartment. I slowly walked around each room, capturing good angles with my camera, trying to show its light and coziness, its neatness and warmth, as if I was advertising not just a place to live, but a part of my soul, into which I had invested so much effort and money. Then I sent all the photos to Danny, adding a detailed description of the rental terms, contract details, and small touches that I hoped would help find decent tenants. 3 days later, I was already sitting on a plane heading to Europe, fully immersed in the anticipation of change, and I felt a slight tremor in my chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation. 2 weeks later, Danny called me with good news. He said that he had found wonderful tenants and the contract had already been signed. It was like music to my ears, because I knew that now the apartment would not hang on me like a heavy burden, but would become a source of stability and confidence. Life in Europe was amazing. The work required concentration and dedication. The city was beautiful to the point that I could wander its streets for hours, enjoying the architecture and atmosphere, and the salary allowed me to feel independent and confident in the future. But the most important thing was that I received rent every month, and this money completely covered my mortgage, allowing me not to worry about the financial side. Danny really turned out to be a reliable friend. He found a wonderful couple of doctors who moved into my apartment and treated it with the same care that I would take care of my own home. I could not have dreamed of a better option. The first month after I left was a real gift. My phone remained silent like a tame animal. No calls from my parents, no harsh messages from Lisa. It seemed like they simply erased me from their lives, and to be honest, I even liked it. I finally felt the peace I longed for. I was enjoying the silence, the work, the new experiences, and the feeling that my life was my own. But then one day, Aunt Carol called. She had always been a special figure to me, my father's sister, wise and reasonable, perhaps the only one in our family who could keep calm and common sense when everyone else was caught up in the drama. "Amelie, dear, how are you getting on?" Her voice was warm and gentle, and I could almost feel her embrace across the ocean. "Listen, I wanted to tell you about Lisa's wedding." The words sounded like a bell, clear and unpleasant. Carol told me that Jake's parents had found out about what had happened in my apartment. They had had to bail their son out of jail after his arrest, and of course, they asked what had happened. Jake, unable to keep his mouth shut, told them the whole story from beginning to end. They were horrified, Carol said, absolutely horrified. According to her, Jake's parents were so shocked by Lisa's behavior and the way she was behaving that they immediately called my parents and said they found it disgusting. In fact, they openly said that they thought Lisa was spoiled, smug, and lacking in moderation. Carol explained that Jake's parents had originally planned to pay for a significant portion of the wedding expenses. They had already put down a deposit for the venue and catering, but after the apartment incident, they had completely pulled out of financial support. They told Lisa and Jake that if they really wanted to get married, they would have to pay for the wedding themselves, Carol continued, and they said they weren't going to encourage that kind of behavior. I listened to her and couldn't help but be amazed. It all seemed both fair and ironic. "Wow," I said, "this is just getting more interesting." Carol sighed and told me that Lisa, having found herself in a difficult situation, went to our mother and began to beg her to let her and Jake live in one of those rented apartments that belonged to my parents. "But your mother said no?" Carol added with a slight grin. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. "So Mom finally understood what rent compensation means," I said, and this moment seemed almost cartoonish to me. "Exactly," Carol confirmed. But the story did not end there. Lisa made a real scandal, threw a terrible tantrum, screamed that it was unfair, that my parents were as greedy as I was. She threw hurtful words in my mother's face, accused her of heartlessness and cruelty, and, as Carol said, it was a sight she would never forget. Mom, of course, didn't like all of this, and the argument ended with Lisa running out of the house in tears and screams. Now she and Jake live in a tiny studio apartment across town, and they barely communicate with my parents. According to Carol, the family is basically in a state of Cold War. Lisa blames me for ruining her wedding plans. My parents blame me for starting all this drama in the first place, and new conflicts flare up between them every day. "Your mom always tells me it's your fault," Carol said, and there was weariness in her voice. "Last week she told me that if you had been a better sister, none of this would have happened." I couldn't believe my ears. "A better sister?" I asked, feeling a wave of indignation rise up inside me. "Are you kidding?" Carol chuckled, but there was sadness in her tone. I told her she was being ridiculous. "You've been more than generous to this family all these years," Carol said, her voice soft but firm, filled with compassion and determination, "and the way they treated you was shameful." I closed my eyes, letting her words sink deep into my soul, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone close to me actually understood me and acknowledged the injustice I'd suffered. Carol had always been the voice of reason, and listening to her, I couldn't help but feel relieved, as if the burden I'd been carrying alone had suddenly been shared with me. "How are Jake and Lisa doing financially?" I asked cautiously, already guessing what the answer would be. Not great, Carol sighed. Jake's doing odd jobs, nothing serious, nothing permanent. Lisa's got a part-time job at a retail store, but she doesn't like it at all. All she does is complain. She said that working in a store was humiliating for her because she felt that her time should be spent solely on wedding preparations. I couldn't help but snort. Did she even try to find a normal job? Full-time? A career? Carol laughed bitterly. You know Lisa. She never had much motivation in this regard. Someone else always had to solve her problems. 3 months later, Carol called again, and I could already tell from her voice that the news would not be good. She said that Jake's parents had tried to meet their son halfway and restore their relationship, but only on one condition, that he apologize to me and try to fix the situation. And what did he do? I asked. He refused, Carol answered. He said that he did nothing wrong and you overreacted by calling the police. I almost dropped the phone. Unbelievable, Carol continued. His parents told him that until he took responsibility for his actions, they didn't want anything to do with him. So now he's lost their support too. Lisa and Jake's relationship, according to Carol, was becoming increasingly shaky. The stress of a constant lack of money, arguments, failed wedding plans, a complete lack of support from both families, all this was weighing on them and destroying their union. They were arguing more and more often, and it seemed that their little world was collapsing right before their eyes. Lisa called your mother recently, Carol continued, crying into the phone, begging her to talk to you and convince you to help them in any way possible. I narrowed my eyes. And what did your mother say? She said she wouldn't call you because you made it clear that you didn't care about your family. I nodded, although Carol couldn't see it. And rightly so. I wouldn't have answered anyway. Months passed. The 6 months of my European assignment flew by quickly and intensely. I was thriving, my work was opening up new horizons for me, and my apartment in America continued to bring in a steady income. Every first of the month, rent was deposited into my account. The mortgage was paid off without delay, and my foreign salary allowed me to put aside savings, which over time added up to a solid sum. I arranged a cozy home here, and it was always full of light and fresh flowers, which I bought every Sunday at the market. I found joy in simple things, walks through the evening city, conversations with colleagues over a glass of wine, a feeling of freedom that accompanied me everywhere. I hadn't heard from my parents or Lisa in months, and that was exactly what I wanted. The silence was a gift to me, proof that I had finally broken free of their clutches. Only Carol called regularly every few weeks to check in on me, to see how I was doing, and to casually share family news. But I had stopped asking even her about Lisa and Jake. I no longer cared what happened to them. They had made their choice, and now they had to live with the consequences. You know, Carol said one evening during one of our calls, her voice soft but firm, I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. Your parents always expected you to be the adult, the responsible one, the one who would resolve other people's crises. But it was time to say no to someone. I took a deep breath. I'm just tired of being taken advantage of. As it should be, she replied. You've worked too hard to build your life, and no one, not family, not strangers, has the right to take that away from you or demand that you give them everything you've earned. Now, sitting in my small but cozy European apartment and looking out at the lights of the big city outside the window, I feel no guilt at all. I know I made the right choice. My apartment at home is well taken care of. All the bills are paid on time, and my life is finally mine alone. Sometimes family isn't the people you share blood with. Sometimes family is the ones who truly respect and support you, who rejoice in your victories and sympathize with your losses. And sometimes the wisest thing you can do is walk away from those who see you as nothing more than a wallet or a shoulder to lean on for their own problems.